Hello and welcome to Electro Pulp Video Magazine. I'm your host, the crotchety old fan, otherwise known as Steve Davidson, and I will be taking you on an intimate tour of yesterday's science fiction and fantasy pulp magazines. Each issue of Electro Pulp Video Magazine, I will be introducing you to a single pulp magazine title drawn from that collection. I'll go over a bit of its history, the publishers and the editors behind it, the authors and artists who appear within its pages, and I'll be illustrating this with images from both those magazines and from various other pieces collected around the web. So please sit back, relax, and prepare yourself to be steeped in the pulpy goodness that is science fiction and fantasy magazine history. This is Volume 1, Issue 1 of Electro Pulp Video Magazine. Today we will be taking a look at the January 1939 issue of Startling Stories. The late 1930s and the early 1940s saw a boom period in the publication of genre pulp magazines. And 1939 was a particularly robust year. One of the most significant titles to be introduced that year was Startling Stories, a magazine that can trace its direct descent from Hugo Gernsback's amazing science fiction stories. Hugo Gernsback is widely considered to be the father of modern science fiction. By modern science fiction we mean those stories, both good and awful, that are self-identified as science fiction stories, if only by their appearance in a magazine that bills itself as a science fiction publication. Most of you are probably familiar with the outline of Hugo Gernsback's story, but in brief, he emigrated to the United States from Hungary. He was a researcher and aficionado of the dawning science of radio electronics, and once in the United States he got heavily into that. He established several broadcast stations, introduced the first build a radio at home mail order kit, and started a publishing empire that featured his initial publication called The Electrical Experimenter, which was devoted to radio and electronic science. Within the pages of Electrical Experimenter and its retitled Science and Invention, Hugo published short stories that featured the developments of technology. Gernsback saw this as a way of interesting his readers in future possibilities, and as a way of expanding the content of his magazines. On a couple of occasions he experimented with publishing complete issues filled with what was termed at the time scientifiction, a portmanteau word of science and fiction. These issues were very, very well received by his readership. By 1925, he'd done a couple of these issues. The response, as I said, was so enthusiastic that Hugo determined that it was time to bring out a magazine devoted entirely to such stories, which led to the introduction of Amazing Stories in April of 1926. In 1929, Gernsback lost his publishing empire to bankruptcy. Some say that it was a forced bankruptcy, a conspiring of his creditors. Others contend that Hugo was just not a good businessman. In either case, he lost Amazing Stories, Electrical Experimenter, which was then titled Science and Invention, and numerous other publications. But he wasn't down for long. In 1930, he introduced two new publications, Science Wonder Stories and Air Wonder Stories. These were very well received and quickly became direct competitors of Amazing Stories. The reason that he so quickly came back is probably due to the fact that he used the mailing list from Amazing Stories to generate initial subscriptions. And again, that has a little bit of historical controversy surrounding it. Some contend that it was illegal for him to have that mailing list. Gernsback himself claims that the information was compiled from other sources. Nevertheless, Air Wonder and Science Wonder were combined into a single title called Wonder Stories, and in 1936 Gernsback sold those magazines off to Better Publications, and which was part of the Thrilling group, Thrilling Western, Thrilling Adventure, Thrilling Mystery, and they reissued the title as Thrilling Wonder Stories. Thrilling Wonder enjoyed a fair amount of success, and by 1939 it was decided that they would publish a companion magazine, one that would feature slightly different stories, and one that would compete directly with Astounding, which at that point in time had become the big kid on the block. The title would be edited by a man named Mort Weisinger, and the magazine would be named Startling Stories. Now, years later, in 1955, after a lot of ins and outs, when the then publication boom was dying down, Startling Stories would remain as a lead title and would eventually absorb Thrilling Wonder and another companion magazine which had initially been titled Fantastic Story Quarterly, now named Fantastic Story. And the final title of these combined publications is probably the longest one in pulp history, and it is three great science fiction magazines in one, Startling Stories combined with Thrilling Wonder and Fantastic Stories. Only one other title, the third Gernsback incarnation and attempt at a science fiction magazine, Science Fiction Plus, can make a claim to such a direct descent from the original Amazing Stories.